Hello, and thank you very much for joining us. We've come together as a group of social work educators to examine some of the issues around peace, solidarity, and support for violence and war. David, if you wouldn't mind sharing our slides, please.
Sorry, we'll need some help with opening up the screen. I can't seem to do that. Sorry.
Yeah, hello.
Hello.
Here we are.
Can I invite you as the speakers talk? If you have any questions, if you want to put it in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on the chat to make sure that I pick up any questions. Our plan is to get through our presentations as seamlessly as possible and try and leave some space at the end for some questions. So my name is Janet Walker and I'm from the University of Lincoln, which is in England. We've tried to frame up our session into before, during and after to give some structure to what we want to talk about. So I'm delighted as our first speaker will be Lena Dominelli from the University of Stirling in Scotland, who will frame up the teaching, knowledge and skills for social work practice as a response to violence and war. Our during section will look at contextualising issues, particularly in Eastern Europe, and also with the support of colleagues Oksana from the university based in Ukraine and Darja, who's from the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. Our colleague Orit from Israel will talk about trauma and resilience in warfare. Our section on after will look at issues of peace and reconciliation. Sadly, our colleague from South Africa can't join us, but our colleague David from New Zealand has got some points on her behalf. And it will end, certainly not least but last, by looking at issues of peace and reconciliation from a New Zealand perspective with colleagues David and Shirley. And a very brief final thoughts. So if I can invite Lena, please, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
You're on mute.
Sorry. David, can you put my slide up, please? I won't necessarily talk to it, but I'll cover all of these points. My starting point is that today we have a new context in which we as social workers dedicated to peace, security in all its forms, whether it's food, income, social order, and so on, are having to rethink our approach to anti-oppressive practice because we have a greedy dictator who is behaving as the hard man, keen to exercise power by being a bully who assaults people who have done nothing to him. In order to do that, he creates the masculine myth of the hero going to free the people of Ukraine from various neo-Nazis, when in fact, he has created a myth to make himself look strong, but actually that myth makes him look weak. And that is why we have to rethink the way in which we, feminists particularly like me, have looked at masculinity and what it does to our sense of peace and security, because Putin single-handedly has destroyed the sense of peace that has held for 70 years in Europe. I do acknowledge that other places have not had peace and that there are 196 different kinds of conflicts going on in the world at the moment. But nonetheless, in doing what Putin has done, the assault on the Ukraine means that he has torn up the international social order And I think, to me, that is an indication of male impotence and cowardice. I'm not going to say more about that because I want to focus on us as social work practitioners and what this means for us. First of all, it means that we do have to hang on to our values, our anti-oppressive values, our commitment to social justice, environmental justice, and social justice in all its forms against sexism, racism, neocolonialism, and all the other forms of isms, even when we are challenged existentially, because we are facing an existential threat, because we are being asked to think, what do we stand for? What do we really want to do in the world? And how do we do it? Especially when we have, as social workers, limited power, because the power structures are rooted in resources, which we do not have. Most social work practitioners, academics, and students have been suffering from austerity and neoliberalism now since the Thatcher years. But nonetheless, we have to look at how we stop a greedy dictator from imposing his will on ordinary people. And we have to take care that ordinary people do not suffer from that kind of approach. Of course, we know this is not going to be easy because today we have faced rises in costs of living, food scarcity, especially in the global south, but also in the global north. The number of people using food banks is rising. Fuel shortages and high prices for fuel. People in the UK talk about, do I eat or heat my home? Those are things that we as social workers know quite well because we have to find ways of helping people to overcome that kind of adversity. And I think in those kind of situations, and I'm really pleased about the people speaking in the after part of this talk, we have to learn from Indigenous people because historically Indigenous people have faced, yes, I would call them assaults on their integrity, their culture, and so on for over 500 years. But they have resisted quite effectively in many respects because they have safeguarded the environment that is so important to all of us. They have encouraged us to think holistically, and certainly the current climate in terms of the context makes me rethink my 202 chart on holistic practice. And that is to include the physical environments that in a way I had not foreseen. And Putin's war makes this very clear. We have to hold accountable and make it a war crime that someone can destroy people's homes, their infrastructure, their water, their power, their electricity, their everything, including when they go shopping, simply to fulfill their greed and their dictatorial ambitions. And we have to stop that as social workers by empowering people at the local level, at the meso level, which is where our national governments come in, and at the international level. So I hope that one of the things that will come out of the People's Summit is that we will make some demands at all of those three levels where we can say, enough is enough. We have to stop the undermining of a rule of law that is based in international conventions and protocols and hold those who break it, and in this case, Putin, accountable as a war criminal because he has added to climate change greenhouse gas emissions, not only because he destroyed what was there to begin with and what that cost the earth. Secondly, in destroying them, he added to greenhouse gas emissions through the discharge of military ordnance. And thirdly, he will add even further because those places have got to be rebuilt. And that will involve all of us in paying the price for his greed, his dictatorship, in terms of having to deal with reducing our carbon emissions to deal with that. So that means that from an anti-oppressive point of view, we have a huge agenda to think about in our curriculum. And I'm only going to have time to look at some of these. One is we have to look at holistic practice and look at all the systems that interact with each other. That includes power, accountability, the distribution of resources, and seek an equitable resolution to global structural inequalities. We have to look at all the bases of power disparities and resource unequal distributions, ranging from ethnic relations, gender, disability, sexual orientation, all of those things that we know. And we have to look for a very nuanced understanding of how we industrialize, how we consume, how we produce to make sure that it is not powered by fossil fuel induced development. So sharing our technologies on a green social work perspective basis is really important. And we build on what we know already. For example, environmental racism was already identified by Roger Bullard in the US in 1980 when he said, the people who pay the most for environmental degradation are the poorest people and usually people who are Black. And from the global South now, we know that in the case of climate change, these small island developing states are going to be the ones facing the worst examples.
1 minute, please, Lena.
Okay, we have to ensure that we stick to our human rights and social justice framework. We have to change policy. We have to encourage social workers to do research so that we have a good evidence base to our practice. And we have to go for co-production and engage with the people who are suffering the worst impacts of the social and economic and environmental injustice, whatever the source. And we have to accept that it will be difficult, but not hopeless, because together we can find the solutions that we need to. We can rebuild a great curriculum, and I'm certainly there to help you do that. Thank you very much. That's it for me.
So I will be the next speaker following my dear colleague, Professor Lina Dominelli, and we'll talk about living through the war from a social work perspective. Myself as an educator, as a social work practitioner, researcher, who with more than 20 years experience in the field. So please, the next slide. I would like to talk today and to draw your attention more specifically to the current context and challenges for social work practice, which Ukrainian people are having right now. So actually, these are challenges not only for practitioners, but also for educators, for researchers, for students as well. As you know, the first stage, active stage of Russian invasion into Ukraine was launched on in 2014. And the second active invasion stage was just around 5 months ago, February 24, 2022. And actually in between, we have been thriving through and living through a lot of challenges and issues which were not probably so clearly seen or evidenced like we are doing it right now in an active war stage. So the stereotypes established by Russian propaganda across the world created around Ukrainians as a nation, as people who is un-Asian or who have so-called language issue that do not accept anyone not speaking Ukrainian, that in Ukraine is filled with Nazi, and everyone who is talking Ukrainian or lives in Ukraine or was born in Ukraine, whose grandparents were born in Ukraine, were supposed to be Nazi, who is devoted to the culture and origin and roots. Everyone by Russian propaganda is supposed to be Nazi. Nazi. So, and Ukraine is presented now across all the world, or has been presented so far by this second stage across the world by Russian propaganda, especially Russia Today channels and social media, as under-nation or nation which doesn't exist or never existed or doesn't even have any right to exist. And is being proved by and evidenced by a lot of investigators, both from Ukraine and international ones, which are coming right now to Ukraine to evidence the war crimes against Ukrainians, that this is the real genocide against Ukrainian people. As a result of this war, at present, for the mid of June, we had around 8 million people of internally displaced or forced displaced people. Can you imagine that this is the whole country or even 2 European countries in one, which had to be displaced somewhere, live, eat, be serviced, yeah, and somehow thrive to continue living, yeah? As well as we have over 6.5 million Ukrainians who became refugees for the mid of July, for the mid of June, sorry, these are the numbers that I'm giving to you, provided by the UN. So actually, here's a huge number, several European countries inside Ukraine, which became IDPs, yeah, and the 1 or even 1.5 of the country, which actually became refugees and are all over the world, actually, not only in Europe, but all over the world right now. Of course, as a result of that, we are facing acute safety and humanitarian challenges. We have a lack of access to healthcare, to social services, lack of food, lack of shelters already inside Ukraine. As the Russian invaders, actually, they keep ruining every day, even in those parts of Ukraine where there are no active battles, so they keep shelling and bombing and ruining hospitals, ruining social centers, kindergartens, schools, blocks of flats with civilians living in them. So we actually have a lot of vulnerable populations right now, are supposed to be not only older people or children, women, people with limited life prognosis or anybody else, but actually every Ukrainian is supposed to be a vulnerable one, because you never know when and where and how the missile would hit. And we have everyday sirens and across the whole Ukraine, as well as we have huge losses of civilians, as well as huge losses amongst Ukrainian soldiers defending Ukraine as a nation right now. We have, for the practitioners, the hugest challenge is shared trauma that my colleague would speak later on today. This is the need to work in the same situation as like your clients are, and actually to help them, but at the same time to care about your families, to care about your job, to care about yourself, which is extremely difficult in such circumstances, where there is no space in Ukraine to be considered a safe one. As a result of this second stage, actually 2 stages already of the war against Ukraine, we have, again, the training needs of social workers raised, because we thought that we have been preparing since 2014 ourselves, yeah, when we were left unprepared to such a actually active invasion. But right now we see that we are not prepared as social workers to the active war. And war is something that ruins everything, all the structures, all the lives of clients, but also all the lives of social work practitioners. And you have to you have to be challenged every day with all these issues and continue working and living. And of course, we have high level of burnout amongst personnel. We have huge mental health problems of various severity, despite the fact that social workers were trained or are supposed to be trained to face such adversities and be able to cope. Still, Ukrainians are supposed to be people with, or nation with a huge or high level of resilience, yeah, that helps them. But such massive trauma and loss did have impact on all of us. And of course, we have a severe lack of coordination of various services for such huge numbers of IDPs. That was another story back to 2014, when most of the country was still stable. Yeah, but despite Crimea and despite the Eastern Ukraine, we had people to help, and we were able to manage the number of IDPs. But right now you see that 8 million, it's 1 or 2 European countries within one country IDPs. And it's really huge humanitarian issues are being addressed at present. In terms of social work students, specific challenges, I would also like to add to all of the above that was told already, that in addition to the last 2 years quarantine because of COVID, where they felt socially isolated, where they were lacking actually communication, interaction, and etc. Since the beginning of the war, they had only online meetings, and only those who had access to internet, because in many places we didn't have gas, water, electricity, and any internet, and even any connection. For 2 months, we were blocked in providing education and in receiving education. But after that, we were offered by the Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine to renew, to restart with all the possibilities which we have right now, the education process, which of course is a huge challenge, especially when students as well as lecturers and practitioners have to play and to be in different roles as volunteers, as fundraisers for the needs of communities and for the needs of the army and for the needs of simple neighborhood people, as promoters of Ukrainian nation as not Nazi, but as a peaceful and the one which receives and accepts everyone everywhere, as stop fake activists, as forced displaced and refugees, as IDPs, as soldiers, and etc. And of course, students had a massive mental health problems, which I myself, as the person chairing the School of Social Work of the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, can say that many students have just dropped out of the education. They took academic leave, and they were not actually, even those who were successful before the war, they just were not so successful and failed in some of the subjects. So difficulties in concentration and learning, in studying, in meeting academic requirements to write your diploma paper, to defend it, to conduct a study, actually, small-scale study to make a research and to defend it, has actually made this process even more complicated. The war made an impact on everyone. And our students across Ukraine, they had to combine study and work, most of the time volunteering and earning living for them and their parents while staying in Ukraine, or especially while staying outside Ukraine, so as not to depend on the external support or aid. Though we are very much grateful to all the countries, to all the supporters, to all of you for such a great support, but Ukrainians are a hardworking nation, is a hardworking nation and a hardworking people, and try to help as much as possible to themselves, but also to the neighbors in the places where they are all the time. The next slide, please. And I would also like to tell about the social work response, especially to turn your attention to social work response, because in addition to the things that you might all already know, to just service delivery, which is not just or simple in these cases, because we have huge humanitarian and MHPSS needs, the NGO sector actually and huge international organizations were of great support as well as governments of many countries were of great support in helping social workers to address all the issues that I've mentioned already.
One minute, please, Oksana.
Okay, we have cities and towns, including universities, as humanitarian hubs for people fleeing the war. We have also been observing social cohesion, which has been enhanced due to the neighborhood awareness and support. Active social media groups, online self-help groups for students, for all types of categories arranged, which have access to internet. Of course, also groups of refugees joining together into large communities and helping each other. And actually, in general, to say that there was a huge community mobilization, not only in Ukraine, but also outside Ukraine, to address the most acute needs which we all faced during this war. I would like to thank all of you, to thank all the audience for your attention. And I would like then to finish my presentation and to pass the word to my colleague, Professor Daria Zavirshek. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Greetings to everyone. I listening to Lena Dominieli. Lena Dominieli mentioned the great caesura that happened in Europe with increased militarization, more refugees, more poverty, more ecological disasters, and other crises. And Oksana Boyko mentioned the fact that that trauma affects the whole country, and from a social work perspective, we can ask ourselves whether trauma can create community or communities. And yes, we do know that trauma can create a community. Next slide, please. Ukrainian poet from Lviv, whose name disappeared from here, from this slide, she said recently that the war experienced by some people and then experiences by people who are not in immediate war situation creates a rift. And the question that we can ask is whether this rift can be overcome by some activities, because we also know that acting actually help us to overcome trauma, and acting then also mean to connect with other people. So East European Sub-Regional Association of the Schools of Social Work, that I'm the president of, immediately after the beginning of the invasion over Ukraine, made a meeting which we named Solidarity and Support with Social Work Educators from Ukraine who are living in war and through the war. And the board members of IASSW and European Association of the Schools of Social Work and some social work academics started to join the meetings with the colleagues from Ukrainian Schools of Social Work. And this we started to call the Transnational Community Building. And yes, I do believe that the transnational community building is showing so far our example that we can overcome ethnic and state divides and nationalisms, and also learn from each other. And so far we had 16 meetings on almost weekly basis. And my colleagues who already spoke, Lena, Oksana, and later on Orit, are members of the Solidarity and Support Network. And we based it on some fundamental social work principles, which we actually know and learn about from the beginning of a social work profession. And certainly it would make sense that we go back to the pioneers of social work profession, for example, Jane Addams, and look at her anti-militarism stance and her fight against the Great War in Europe over 100 years ago. So the basic fundamental social work principles that we apply when over the time since the war started and with the meetings is that we try to express our compassion and care for each other, and we try and we want to be the living witnesses of people who live in war and also of those who fled. One of social work academics said, "I was frozen since the war started, but the solidarity meetings on Zoom helped me to defroze." It came to my mind that in the unstable lives, people move the country or people move within the country. One of the social work academics said, "I moved 7 times so far because nowhere is safe." The Zoom meeting is, it's almost a kind of a safe place. We also ask the colleagues about the immediate needs. And we wanted to become an international voice of the people who are in war. And we know too often from other wars that as the war goes on, people became the refugees from a country or a mass, or even what Primo Levi was called the figures. So in order to overcome the crisis of humanitarianism, but also the social anesthesia, it was at most important that we were in a continuous weekly communication with our social work educators from Ukraine. We also wanted to get the first-hand information in the times when the media have become another war zone and propaganda. I remember that on the very first Zoom meeting which we hold, social work academics from Ukraine informed us about the dead soldiers from the invasion army, whom nobody want to take back home because nobody want to acknowledge that people died. And there was a request from a humanitarian perspective to tell the international audience that people have the right to be buried and sent home. We also learned about the prevention of humanitarian evacuation days before the media actually informed us about that. We also were informed about forced evacuations and taking away the passports of the people and the documents. We were informed about the increase on girls and women sexual violence by the soldiers, how difficult it is for people with disabilities to move to shelters, to move with a wheelchair, to breach the unbreachable barriers, to flee the war. We learned about the difficulties the students have and the old people and their feelings of belonging. Many of them don't want to flee. They have no command of English, they have no financial means, and they want to stay in their homes, in their flats, in their country. And there are several also ethical issues around that and the issues of safety. And this was extremely important to talk through. We also use the existing social work and other social science knowledge production that exists already from other war zones. And we distributed the material, we send the material to the colleagues, we provide useful information and linking people with knowledge to the colleagues from Ukraine.
1 minute, please, Dalja.
We also wanted to support people with the need live the everyday normality. We respected the individual identities, and we recognize that talking about our academic achievements and our academic striving and our activism and work in communities also means that we do keep, in horrible times, we do keep a sense of normalcy, normality that is actually also a tool to overcome trauma. We also try to bring schools of social work and social work teachers closer to the international social work communities, to IA, European Association, and more. And we learned from each other. And next slide, just to give you the picture of it. We achieved a lot. We wrote, we shared, we taught, we provide workshops, and we continue to fight against war fatigue. We continue to fight against social anesthesia, and we continue to fight for peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your remarkable speech, and especially that you help us to understand what is going on in Ukraine. And this is a wider picture about our responsibility as a social workers. And I would like to take you to do zoom in with me. Please, next slide. So I would like to share with you a model of education that I think is essential component why we are all exposed to a war. And we have a lot of work, as just mentioned, but for us, or for me, it is very essential component to understand trauma theory and to understand the negative effects of being direct exposure to war. I say we, and I mean to every human being, including, of course, us as a social workers, because we are, first of all, human beings. And in a time of war, we have a lot of emotional, physical, behavioral responses, and we need to be aware of them. So first of all, my first recommendation is to help us to know all of these variety responses that we have, the negative ones like PTSD, acute stress, and so forth. As Daria just mentioned about the woman that report that she is freezed while she were under attack. And in addition to that, we have to understand the positive aspects. Maybe I learned to know that I have more strength than I feel before. So it's important to see the two parts of the phenomena, the negative and the positive aspect of being exposure to war, and to know what is my way of coping as a person and as a social worker. After I know that, I need to understand or to reveal the cultural aspect of it. As Oksana mentioned, the Ukrainians are strength. They believe that they will overcome. And it's important to understand, because if I hold this kind of ideas, when I feel weak, maybe I'm not good enough. And it's important to understand the dynamic between the macro and the micro ways of coping with adversities. And now I switch to the third circle. And as a trauma worker, or as a parent, as a family members, we have indirect effects, because we see a lot of people with negative and positive responses. Especially with the negative, we all know secondary traumatization, compassion fatigue, and so forth. Something happened to us while we are offering help to other in a regular situation, and think about war situation, and you understand that we are more stressful. While we are more stressful, we are more tuned to be affected by the indirect effects. So again, we have to understand the indirect trauma and the indirect resilience, because from time to time we learn from the other how to cope, or how to cope better than I think before. So all of this together, while we combine between the direct and indirect, we call it shared trauma. And unfortunately, the current situation in Ukraine is a shared trauma, because us as a social workers, while we are offering help, we are simultaneously exposed to the same events, and we have no time to walk through, to understand what happened to us, how to oscillate between ourselves, our families, our relatives, to our clients. And all of these boundaries become very, very blurred. And it's difficult or challenging to hold these two. But in addition to that, we have to learn more about our historical trauma and resilience and growth in order to explore about our own history, but simultaneously with our nation or society collective trauma. Immediately we resonance the Second World War while we are talking about the Ukrainian current war. This and match help us to understand the complexity of being exposure to the current event while we are resonancing our previous events. And we, in addition to that, Oksana helps us to understand that this is ongoing event. This is not a short time. We need to deal with it since half a year. It's a long period of time, and within that time, we have more intense period and we have more cumulative calm period. And between that, we need to know how to move between emergency situation and, let's say, routine. Although it sounds like oxymoron, emergency routine, but this is the reality, because there is a day that I can go out with the sun and everything like as normal, and in a minute there is a siren and there is a missile. So I need to know how to shift, how to oscillate, and how to manage kind of health while there is two phases in the same session. In addition to that, we need to understand something about my society, the collective context, how we develop our identity. We know from the literature that a lot of nations need a kind of an enemy to create their sense of belongingness, sense of sameness. But we all know that this is difficult, especially in a day after. And I know that David will talk about post-war situation, that we need to do more peace working, while I'm talking about the acute situation while we are both under war. The next
1 minute,
slide,
please.
please. Yeah.
Thank you. 1 minute, please.
Yeah. So as I said, it's important to understand that the negative, the positive responses may occur simultaneously, although the majority of the population that we are meeting while we are under a war report on a negative part, but please pay attention that a lot of people succeed to do better than they do in a normal time. Trauma and resilience are ecological concepts. It's important to understand it's not just the individual, as my colleagues already talked, it's the micro and the meso and the macro. All of them together are very, very important. It's important to offer special training for that, for the acute. It's not just our regular way of educating students. As mentioned, training, research, all of those are very, very important, in addition to help our students and help ourselves to walking through both the negative and the positive aspect of being under war, and to understand, as I said, the oscillation, how to oscillate between emergency situation and return to routine, and always to think about the day after, about the future. It's important to give support and to get supervision, ongoing supervision. And my final point is very, very important, to get recognition. And I hope this summit, and in addition to other activities, help our Ukrainian colleague to raise their voice. And we will be listening to what is going on there, and not think that we are, as outsider, can do better than the local, the social work in Ukraine on the ground, because they know how, when, where to do the work, although it's very, very challenging. Thank you very much.
Shahana Razul does not have any slides and is not here at the presentation, but I am sharing some comments from her on her behalf. Sawabona, assalamu alaikum, kia ora, namaste. I'm saying a few words today on behalf of Shahana Razul from the University of Johannesburg, South Africa, and the Palestinian colleagues who are not with us today, as a sign of protest as part of the academic boycott. They choose not to be present on this panel today because they refuse to normalize the occupation of Palestine by being present, but are also concerned about the erasure of the Palestinian social work voice on IASSW. As Tata Nelson Mandela said, we can never be free until the Palestinians, and I add other oppressed groups here, are free. Unfortunately, Palestine, the Rohingyas, and other oppressed groups don't get the same support from the international community and even IASSW as Ukraine is now receiving. I'm glad that we are taking an anti-war and anti-occupation stance, but this needs to be done for other contexts as well. We couldn't even make a statement in support of the Palestinian people to end the Israeli occupation of their land, but are clear in our stance against Russia. This is an example of uneven-handedness in the response of the international community, including IASSW. This bias in how we deal with situations needs to be addressed, and we need to be conscious of power relations and inequality at a global level. Otherwise, it begs the question, whose human rights are we only concerned with, and who are we leaving behind? Since this is our theme, leaving no one behind, we need to think carefully about whether we really mean it. Turning to South Africa. South Africa was hailed as the Rainbow Nation and seemed to provide hope for the world as a beacon of peace and reconciliation, both nationally and internationally. Sadly, 27 years later, we are still struggling with enormous social issues, race and gender-based inequalities, and rampant corruption. This transition post-apartheid has mostly benefited an elite few, leaving many in poverty. Whilst extreme poverty has reduced with the introduction of the various grant schemes, inequality has exacerbated. An intersectional analysis is still critical in South Africa, where race, class, and gender bias coexist to exacerbate poverty. One of the key issues is land redistribution. Until wealth and land are redistributed, inequality will remain. This is a key social issue that social workers need to focus on. the ongoing concentration of resources in the hands of an elite few entrenches the coloniality of power. We see a similar situation in Palestine, where issues of land occupation and eviction of Indigenous communities has created another apartheid state. In South Africa, we said never again would we allow apartheid to happen. Yet colonialism, not just coloniality, still exists in our world currently, as well as apartheid, where Indigenous people are oppressed, harassed, and living in fear on a daily basis. The Amnesty International and United Nations reports are evidence of Palestinian oppression under Israeli apartheid occupation. These Amnesty and International reports and daily news reports record these atrocities, and Palestinians, like their South African counterparts living under apartheid occupation, are simply resisting against modern-day colonialism and oppression by the Israeli apartheid government and the fourth largest occupation army, the Israeli Defense Force. There is separate development in which the Israelis, like privileged white people in South Africa, are privileged at the expense of the indigenous population, the Palestinians. There are checkpoints and military harassment of civilians on a daily basis. This is evident from news reports broadcast by the international media. Since 2000, the occupying army has detained approximately 1,000 Palestinians, and some are still in detention without trial. This happened under South African apartheid as well. Palestinians on a daily basis experience demolition of their homes and the creation of ghettos, as documented in the independent Amnesty International and human rights reports. When we talk of international social work, in our actions as social workers and educations, we need to take into account the coloniality of power, gender, knowledge, thinking, and being. If we don't do something, we perpetuate and are complicit with inequalities and injustice in every country that experiences this scourge. We have to take account of unequal power relations. We've seen race-based discrimination in the dealing with migrants and refugees throughout the world. This was highlighted again in the Ukrainian situation, both with the way in which Black students were treated and the discriminatory refugee and migration policies of many parts of Europe, where Ukrainians are welcome and given opportunities and access, but other migrants and refugees are turned back or excluded and made illegal. As an international social work body, we need to ask, whose human rights are we really concerned with? Who do we exclude in our interventions, policies, and practices? When we talk of social justice, who do we leave behind? Let us be true to our theme, be just, and live up to the theme, leave no one behind. And that ends Shahana's presentation. I'll now hand over to Shirley Ikala, who will present.
Tēnā koe, David. Taka wharawhau e te tūtanga o te puhi o wana mai ai te ao, Māori e. Te ihi, tō wehi, tō mana e tu, e tu. Ko tupuriri te tangata ko Ngāti Whātua ora kei toku iwi. Tēnei te mihi, kei te mihi, kei te mihi mahana kia koutou. Tangata whenua, Māori are Indigenous peoples of Aotearoa, New Zealand. I am Indigenous, I am tangata whenua, I am Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei. It was my ancestors who signed Te Tiriti o Waitangi in 1840. That was to ensure that my whakapapa, my genealogy, and that of all Māori was protected and that future generations could thrive. It guaranteed equal rights, the autonomy to lead our people, manage our lands, protect our language and cultural practices and cultural norms. It was a partnership built on equality and respect between Māori and the Crown. But from 1840 onward, many promises were broken and they were not honoured, and a process of assimilation was embarked on by the British authorities. Systematic genocide was the method engaged, and enacted through wars, land confiscation, introduction of diseases where 40% of the population of our people declined, imprisonment, legislation that created white authority, one law for all with no recognition of the place of tangata whenua, Indigenous peoples of Aotearoa. One of our leaders, Ani Makaire, writes of the attempts over the last 180 years to reshape and remake Māori into the image of the colonizer, and refers to this as cultural genocide, with the deliberate assault on our language, our belief systems, and our cultural practices. Our language was replaced by English, our laws replaced by the British legal system, and our belief systems with Christianity. But Māori have paid the price for citizenship. Intergenerational trauma through the process of colonisation, and its impact is reflected today in the current negative statistics of where Māori are. They have been deprived of their lands, their resources, their power, and their authority. Māori have been driven into a state of poverty, deprivation, and marginalisation, and are disproportionately represented in all negative social, economic statistics to this day. But we never ceded our tino rangatiratanga, our self-determination. He whawhai tonu, the struggle is real. Māori have sought redress since 1840 with the emergence of Māori protest movements. And an example of tino rangatiratanga, self-determination, is of my people, Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei. They led the occupation of 507 days of Bastion Point, our ancestral lands, Takaparawhau, my ancestral land. This occupation was the catalyst for the establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal, a legal process by which breaches of Te Treaty could be lodged by Māori and investigated. This is one but many resistant movements that was occurring. A new chapter for Aotearoa New Zealand and a hope and restoration has begun. 2022, on the 29th of June this year, marks the year of the inaugural celebration of the Māori New Year, Matariki, as an Indigenous public holiday for Aotearoa New Zealand. Matariki has been referred to as a historic moment in Aotearoa New Zealand's history as the first Indigenous public holiday and the first Indigenous celebrations to be recognised as a public holiday in a settler colonial state, and is embedded and led by Mātauranga Māori and Tikanga, our Indigenous bodies of knowledge. This is a celebration that recognises the momentous efforts of my ancestors and their vision when they signed Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and it is a key milestone for Māori and Aotearoa as a whole. But it hasn't been easy. It has taken a long time for Māori voices to be heard or even invited to the table in many spheres, and to be considered by those engaged in places like social work, advocacy, environmental, or in policy formulation. When they engage with Māori, they're not at the table. There are two cultural paradigms in Aotearoa where one culture has dominated and been privileged for far too long in all spheres, particularly education. There's been a deliberate misremembering of our history that has obscured the reality of the damage and long-term damage of colonisation for Māori. So the question we must ask is, what does the disremembering of the history and position of Māori and for Indigenous people of the world mean for social work education, when Māori and Indigenous people of the world are disproportionately represented in all negative social and economic statistics, where organisation and structural barriers continue to exclude? It is imperative that to work with Māori and I believe other Indigenous groups in an authentic and respectful way, we need to ensure that our teachings are of truth. And this means having the courage to move towards social work practice, social work education, curriculum that is authentic and provides equal space for all. Kia koe, Rawiri.
Thank you, Shirley. In our last few moments, I see Janet thinking our time is nearly up. I want to say that I'm someone who represents the dominant group in New Zealand as someone with white British heritage, who's been part of the dominant group and who has benefited and had privilege from our Western-based social work and social work education. So our new commitment in New Zealand is to have Indigenous as well as Western-based knowledge part of social work. which means that we need to be sharing our the leadership of our profession as Shirley and I are sharing this presentation today. So it's my privilege to finish up on that note, and I'll hand back to Janet.
Thank you, David. We have much to say and can only explore some of the very kind of tip of the iceberg. Thank you very much to all our speakers. Really grateful. We stand in solidarity with our colleagues in the Ukraine. We also recognise and acknowledge the impact of war that is across the globe. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I think we finished. Thanks, colleagues.
You did an excellent presentation.
Music's getting to me. I've heard it so much.
Hello, Barbara. Nice to hear your voice. Thanks to everybody. I think it was great.
Thank you, Shirley. So you on YouTube group. Really interesting. And Oksana, after everything that's going on. Thank you.